The afternoon light was thin on Leveson Street. A servant was polishing brass at the door of number 20. Inside, a kettle sang on the hob, and a small boy laughed at something his mother had said. The house smelled of coal smoke and boiled linen. It was the last quiet hour they would ever know. A man stood on the step in a dark coat, his hat low, his shoes wiped clean. He had answered the notice in the parlour window. He smiled at the servant and gave a name that was not his own. The door closed behind him. Somewhere above, a clock struck 3. Down in the scullery, a knife lay on a wooden board. Rain began, soft as breath, against the glass. And in the whole of Liverpool, no one yet knew what had begun. A house on Leveson Street. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. This is the Bedside Historian. I am glad you are here. Tell me, if you would, where you are listening from tonight. Perhaps a bedroom under a slanted roof, with the rain on the window. Perhaps a kitchen that has finally gone still after a long day of children. Perhaps a car in a lay-by, or a room in a hospital, or a bed in a place that is not your own. It is late somewhere for you, or early, or that soft in-between hour when the clocks feel a little kinder than usual. Whichever it is, I hope you have a blanket. I hope the tea has cooled to the right temperature. I hope your feet are warm. Before we begin, may I ask a small favour? If my voice keeps you company tonight, please press the button that says you are here. A tap of the like. A subscription, if you have not left one before. A quiet mark on the tally, so that this corner of the night can grow a little larger. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you know. I am grateful, always, for the listeners who reach out a hand in the dark. Now let us drift backward together. We are going to England, and to a city on a wide grey river, and to the spring of 1849. The world has no telephones yet, and no wireless, and no motor cars. The streets are lit by gas that hisses softly inside glass globes. The century smells of horses and coal and the sea. And in one narrow street, in one ordinary house, a family is going about its afternoon, and none of them know that their name is about to be written into the ink of history and left there for good. We are on Leveson Street. It ran off Great George Street, in the south end of Liverpool, in a district built for people who were doing well enough. Not rich. Not grand. Comfortable. The houses were of red brick that had gone plum dark under the smoke of the town. Each one stood 3 stories tall, with a short flight of stone steps to a painted door, and a shallow area below the pavement where the coal was dropped and the tradesmen came and went. There were no gardens at the front, only iron railings and an iron scraper for boots. The flags of the pavement were often wet, because it was Liverpool, and in Liverpool the rain fell the way other cities breathe. Number 20 stood in the middle of a terrace. It had a bow window on the ground floor, and a fanlight above the door, and lace curtains that a careful hand had washed and pressed the week before. It looked like every other house on the street. That was the point of it. It was the sort of address a respectable family took when the husband was away at sea, and the wife wished to be near her shops, and her church, and the harbour where the letters came in. The house belonged, that spring, to the Hinrichsons. He was Captain John Hinrichson, a Dane by birth, a master mariner in the merchant trade. He was fair and quiet in company, with the burnt hands of a man who had spent his working life on ropes and rigging. In the March of that year he was not in England. He was months out on a long voyage, and no letter from him would reach the house on Leveson Street before the summer. That is how time worked then. You wrote in October and were answered in March. You went to sea, and you trusted that when you came back there would still be a lamp lit in the parlour window and small feet running down the stairs to meet you. She was Anne Hinrichson. She was in her 30s. She was expecting their 3rd child in the autumn. I want you to see her for a moment, because we will keep her company for a long while tonight, and it matters that you know her a little before the world begins to move. She had the tidy manner of a captain's wife who had learned to run a household by herself for months at a time. She wore the plain dark dresses of a respectable mother, and a white collar, and her hair pinned back in a low knot. She was not from Liverpool by birth. The record on where she came from is thin, and I do not want to say more than I know. What is certain is that by the spring of 49 she had made this narrow terrace house her own, and she moved through its 4 floors with the easy authority of the woman who ran it. She had 2 little boys. The older was Henry. He was 5. He had the round, soft face of a child who had not yet lost his baby cheeks, and he was said to be a clever boy, and to sit still for stories, and to fold his hands when he was told. The younger was named for his father, John. He was 3. He was the noisier of the 2. He liked to bang on the fender with a wooden spoon, and to run barefoot across the parlour rug, and to laugh at things no grown-up could see. Their mother scolded them in the way of a woman who was not really angry. She kept a work-basket by the parlour fire, and she mended their stockings by lamplight after they had gone to bed. There was one other soul in the house that spring, a young woman named Mary Parr. She was the servant, a maid of all work, and she was perhaps in her early 20s, though the record on her age is not perfectly firm. She came from a poor family, in the way of most young women in domestic service then, and she had been with the Hinrichsons for some months. She slept in a room at the top of the house, up under the slates, where the rain sounded very close on wet nights. She rose before the mother of the house, laid the fire, brought up the coal, drew the water, blackened the grate, and had the breakfast table set by 8. She did the washing on Mondays and the ironing on Tuesdays, and the marketing on Fridays. She was fond of the 2 boys. They ran to her when she came in from the yard with her sleeves rolled and her hands red from the cold. That was the household. A mother, 2 young sons, a servant girl, and, in a wooden crib upstairs, a set of tiny clothes being sewn for a baby not yet born. 4 people breathing under the same slates. 4 people whose names would soon be written in every newspaper in the kingdom. Walk through the house with me, before the world changes for it. You came in from the street through the painted front door. To the right, as you stepped in, was the parlour, with the bow window and the lace curtains, and a piano that Anne had brought with her when she married. The wallpaper was a pattern of little brown flowers. A framed sampler hung above the mantel, sewn by Anne herself as a girl, with a verse from Scripture worked into the cross-stitch. Behind the parlour was the dining room, plainer, with a table and chairs and a print of a full-rigged ship above the sideboard, and a decanter that had been a wedding gift. Down a short passage you came to the kitchen at the back, where the range stood black and hot against the wall, and copper pans hung above it in a row. Upstairs, on the first floor, was the drawing-room at the front and Anne's bedchamber at the back. The drawing-room was where she received callers, when she received any, which in those slow months of her husband's absence was not often. Her bedchamber looked out over the yard, and the wall of the neighbour's house, and a narrow strip of grey sky. On the top floor were 2 more rooms. In one slept the boys. In the other slept Mary. Above them was only the roof, and the pigeons, and the sound of Liverpool at night. That was the house. That was the world. Now, if you will, come back down with me to the parlour window on a March afternoon in 1849, because a quiet thing had happened there, only a week or so before our story really begins. Anne Hinrichson had asked Mary to place a card in the lower pane of the bow window. It was a plain white card, with 3 words on it in a neat hand. Furnished lodgings. Enquire within. It was not unusual. A great many households in Liverpool took in a lodger, especially those where the husband was at sea and the wife was carrying the weight of the rent alone. An upstairs room, a place at the table for breakfast and supper, the use of the parlour fire in the evenings if the lodger was quiet and respectable. In return, the family received perhaps 10 or 12 shillings a week, which in that year was a real easing of the household books. Anne had thought it over through the winter. She had put the idea off, because of the children, because of the coming baby, because a strange man in the house was not a light matter. But by March she had made her mind up. The card went into the window on a Tuesday. It was still there, some days later, when a man in a dark coat paused on the pavement and read it. That is a story for later, and I do not wish to hurry us. For now, stay in the house. Stay in the warm parlour, and the sound of the kettle in the back kitchen, and the murmur of the two boys playing on the rug with a set of wooden animals that had been carved for them one winter aboard their father's ship. Stay with Anne, who is sitting near the window with a piece of white muslin across her knees, sewing a tiny gown for the child she is carrying. Stay with Mary, who is upstairs in the boys' room, folding a clean shirt and laying it in a drawer. Listen. There is a clock on the mantel. It ticks. A coal shifts in the grate. It clinks. Out in the street, a horse goes by at a walk, and a woman calls to a child in a voice too far off to make out, and a bell rings for the half hour at a church you cannot quite place. This is what a happy house sounded like in Liverpool in 1849. Not silent. Not still. Only the ordinary noises of ordinary lives. We do not have a record of what Anne said to the boys that afternoon. The parish books do not follow us in that close. 2 neighbours later gave different accounts of the quiet week before the killings, and both of them were certain. So I will not put an exact word in her mouth. Any I invented would be a lie, and I do not want to lie to you tonight. Let her sit. Let her sew. Let the light change on the wall behind her as the afternoon grows longer. I have stood, in another life, on the street where this house once was. It is not there any more. The whole of that terrace was pulled down long ago, and the ground was built over and built over again, and if you went there today you would not know what had been. The place where number 20 stood is very ordinary now. I would rather you did not go looking for it. Some doors are better left closed. But in the spring of 1849 the house was standing. The kettle was on. The card was in the window. The child in Anne Hinrichson's body was quiet and alive, and would live, in her, for a few more days. Henry was old enough to fetch his own cup of milk from the kitchen if his mother asked him to. Little John was still at the age when he would climb into a lap without asking. Mary was young enough that she hummed as she worked, in the way of country girls who have not yet learned to keep the sound tucked inside. And somewhere in that same city, on that same grey afternoon, walking through streets we have not yet visited together, a man was moving toward Leveson Street, who had already decided what he meant to do. He would not knock for a day or two yet. He was watching. He was listening. He was learning the rhythm of the house from a distance, in the way a certain kind of man learns a house before he enters it. He had seen the card in the window. He had noted the hour when the servant went out for bread. He had counted, from the pavement, how many little voices carried from the front room. He would come to that door in his own time. For now, keep your eyes closed. The clock is still ticking. The coals are still red. The lace curtain still stirs a little in the draught from the pavement. In this hour, the 4 of them are still living, and the house on Leveson Street is still only a house, and Liverpool is still only a city by the water, going about its evening in a haze of coal smoke and gulls, quite unaware that anything at all is beginning. Let us hold them there, gently, a little longer, before the world begins to move. The city by the water. Come away with me from the house for a little while. We will leave the 2 boys to their wooden animals, and their mother to her sewing, and Mary to her folded shirts, and step out onto the pavement. The door of number 20 closes behind us. The card is still in the window. We turn our backs on Leveson Street and walk down toward the water, because to understand what is coming, you have to understand the city that made it possible. Liverpool in the spring of 1849 was one of the busiest places in the world. That is a plain sentence, and it is easy to say, but it is worth pausing on. Liverpool was not a great city in the way of London or Paris. It had no palace, no cathedral to compare, no seat of empire. What it had was the Mersey. The river ran wide and grey past its western edge, and along that edge, for nearly 3 miles, stood a chain of wet stone docks that had been dug and walled and lined with warehouses. Each dock was a rectangle of dark water hemmed by granite, joined to its neighbours by narrow gates through which the ships passed on the tide. From the top of any warehouse roof you could look down and see a thicket of masts. It was so thick, in that year, that a man who had come from a country town would stop on the pavement and stare. The masts crossed each other in every direction. The rigging was strung with drying sails that stood out grey against a sky that was almost the same colour. Between the ships the water shone in flat plates of oil and coal dust and rain. The ships came in from everywhere. From New York with cotton in the hold, and from New Orleans with bales stacked to the deck beams, and from Alexandria with grain, and from the West Indies with sugar in barrels, and from the coast of West Africa, and from the yards of Nova Scotia, and from the Baltic with timber lashed in long pale piles. Cotton was the great tide of the port. In that year the mills of Lancashire were spinning it as fast as the ships could bring it, and the mills of Lancashire were the reason Liverpool had grown so fast, and so hard, and so rich, in the 50 years before our story. You could hear the port before you saw it. There was a low, steady noise all along the waterfront that never quite went out. It was the noise of hooves on stone, and cartwheels on stone, and casks being rolled, and iron rings being struck. There were the shouts of the dockers to one another, in accents from every county in England and every county in Ireland, and voices from further off besides. Norwegian, Welsh, a scrap of German, a scrap of Portuguese. Overhead the gulls kept up their thin, high crying. Underneath it all was the smell. I want you to understand the smell, because the sources dwell on it, and no chapter on Liverpool in that year should skip it. It was the smell of a working port. It was tarred rope, and wet oak, and horse. It was cotton in the bale, which had a warm, dry vegetable smell of its own. It was tobacco leaf, and salted fish, and the sour breath of the tanneries a little to the north. It was the sweeter reek of the sugar refineries, and the yeasty air of the breweries near the top of Dale Street. It was the smoke of soft coal from 10,000 chimneys, hanging low over the roofs on windless days. And beneath all of that, always, was the river itself, running muddy and cold and salt. Let us walk up from the water for a moment. If you stood on the dock road and turned your back on the ships, the ground rose in front of you, gently at first, then more steeply. The town climbed the slope in bands. Nearest the water were the warehouses. Behind the warehouses were the counting houses of the merchants, in tall thin buildings of brown stone, with brass plates by the doors giving the names of the firms. Behind the counting houses were the great streets of business, and behind the streets of business were the churches and the town hall and the exchange, and behind those, spreading south and east across a low ridge, were the streets where people lived. The streets where people lived were not one kind of street. They were many. Up the hill, to the south, where Leveson Street ran, and where the Hinrichsons kept house, the streets were of the middling sort. Solicitors lived there, and clerks in the shipping offices, and the wives of sea captains, and the widows of army officers with a small pension and a servant of their own. The houses were of the plum-dark brick I have already shown you, 3 stories high, with fanlights and iron scrapers, and a strip of pavement kept clean by whichever maid was fastest with the water pail in the morning. But you did not have to walk far to find another Liverpool altogether. Down toward the north end of the town, and in the tight blocks behind the docks, the streets narrowed until a cart could barely pass. The houses were of blackened brick that had never been washed. They were built back to back, wall against wall, so that no window looked out of the rear of them. In between the rows ran a warren of what the town called courts. A court was a short, narrow yard, reached from the main street by a covered passage no wider than a man's shoulders, and around each court a further ring of tiny houses had been packed in, 3 or 4 to a side. In each of those houses lived, on any given night, 10 or 12 people. Some had been divided into rooms, some into cellars. A single cellar could hold a whole family. The floor was of beaten earth. The ceiling was low enough to touch. The one window, if there was a window, opened onto the boots and skirts passing on the pavement above. This was where the fever lived. Not one fever. Several. Typhus, called ship fever and jail fever, spread by the lice in dirty clothing. Typhoid, spread by fouled water. Cholera, which had swept the town in a great wave the summer before, and which was expected back with the warm weather any month now. Consumption, which had never left. Fever was so common in those streets that the parish burial books were full of it, and the doctors of the town had grown used to the sight of a mother in a doorway holding a wasted child in a shawl, and had a word for the look of the skin, and knew the smell of a room where a person had been ill for a long time. The fever hung in the air in that particular corner of the North End because of who lived there. They were, most of them, Irish. Here I want to slow down, because this is the piece of the story you must have in order for anything else in it to make sense, and it is a piece the newspapers of the day handled very poorly. Ireland, in the 4 years before our chapter, had been through the worst famine in modern European memory. The potato crop had failed in the autumn of 1845, and failed again in 46, and failed nearly completely in 48. Around 1 million people had died in Ireland from hunger and from the fevers that hunger brought. Another 1 million had left. They had left in every direction, but the shortest crossing from the west of Ireland to any English port was the crossing to Liverpool, and Liverpool was where they landed. They landed in numbers no city in Britain had ever seen before. In the single year of 1847, nearly 300,000 Irish men, women and children came off the boats onto the Liverpool waterfront. Some passed straight on to Canada and to New York on the emigrant ships that were then leaving the Mersey almost every day, but tens of thousands stayed. They stayed because they had no fare to go further. They stayed because they were too weak to travel. They stayed because a sister or a cousin had come the year before and had sent word of a court off Vauxhall Road where there was room in a cellar. By the spring of 49, roughly 1 in every 5 people in the town was Irish. They were not welcomed. It is important to say that plainly. The English press of the day wrote about them in ugly language, and the householders of the middling streets, the sort who lived in streets like Leveson Street, wrote in their letters and their diaries of the smell of them, and the disease they carried, and the drunkenness of the poorest of them. Some of that was frightened talk, and some of it was cruel talk, and some of it was simply what people say about strangers when the strangers are many and hungry. I do not want to soften it. It is the air the story you are hearing tonight was breathing. But you need to see, as well as hear, the people the words were about. They were farmers who had never lived in a town before. They spoke Irish to one another on the pavement, and did their best in English at the shop. They wore the coats they had been given by charities in the ports of the west of Ireland before they sailed. They queued at the parish soup kitchen, which was kept by the workhouse on Brownlow Hill, for a bowl of thin oatmeal and a piece of grey bread. They took whatever work the docks would give them, which was mainly the loading and the unloading of ships by hand, at a wage of about 2 shillings a day for a man in the summer and 18 pence a day for a man in the winter. They lived in the courts, and they died in the courts, and they were buried in unmarked ground at the corner of St. Anthony's and at Ford, in coffins so light that a single mourner could carry one. That was the Irish quarter. It began only 10 minutes' walk from the Exchange, where a merchant might make £10,000 on a single ship's cargo. That was the shape of Liverpool in 1849. Money and hunger were neighbours. Between the two Liverpools there was a third one, and it is this third one you should picture most carefully now, because it is where our man was moving. It was the Liverpool of the lodging houses, and the eating houses, and the back street public houses, and the pawn shops. A lodging house was a large old building, often 4 stories high, divided inside into as many beds as the landlord could fit. A bed cost a man 3d a night in the cheaper places, or 4d for a bed with a straw mattress, or 6d for a bed with a sheet on it. In a single room you might find 8 or 10 strangers sleeping side by side, and no one asked for a name that was true. In the parlour downstairs, a woman kept a pot of stew going on the range from morning till night, and a mug of beer could be had at any hour. Sailors between voyages lodged in such houses. Dockers who had lost their footing lodged in such houses. Irishmen just off the boat lodged in such houses. And so, when the mood took them, did men who did not want to be found. The pawn shops of Liverpool in that year stood on almost every corner of the poorer streets. Their windows glinted with watches and rings and silver spoons and rolled bundles of clothing that other people had once owned. The pawnbroker gave you a few coins for a coat or a candlestick, and a numbered ticket, and 30 days to bring the coins back and take your thing home. Most people did not come back. It was the bank of the poor. It was also, without anyone saying so, the market for anything a person might wish to sell, without being asked too many questions. Do you see now what kind of place this was for a man to disappear into? A stranger could walk off a boat in the afternoon and be in a bed by night, with no one on the pavement able to name him. He could shave his moustache and change the hat he was wearing, and drop his baptismal name in favour of another, and step out into a street of 40,000 faces where no one had ever seen him before. If he had a good coat and clean shoes and a mild voice, he could pass as a merchant's clerk in the middling streets. If he had a rougher accent and worn boots, he could pass on the dock road as a mate between ships. He could sit at a table in a chop house on Paradise Street and eat a plate of mutton and potatoes for 8p, and no one would ask him a single thing about himself. This was the great terrible gift Liverpool gave to a certain kind of man in that year. I do not know, and no one now knows with real certainty, how many days our man had been in the town before he stopped in front of the parlour window on Leveson Street. The record is thin on that, and the accounts he later gave of himself were mostly lies. What is certain is that he had been in Liverpool long enough to learn its habits. He had learned where a stranger might sleep for a few coppers. He had learned where a pawnshop would take a silver spoon at dusk without a raised eyebrow. He had learned which streets ran empty in the afternoon and which streets kept a policeman on the corner. He had learned the way the middling houses looked from the pavement, and the way to read a card in a parlour window, and the sort of woman who would answer the door when he knocked. Somewhere in a lodging house that we cannot now name, in a room shared with strangers who did not know him, he had already made up his mind. Come back with me now to Leveson Street. The walk up through the town has taken us the better part of an hour, and the light has begun to go. The gas lamps are being lit along the main streets by a man with a long pole and a blue flame at the end of it. In the middling terraces, the servants are drawing the curtains against the dusk. In the courts off Vauxhall Road, a woman is boiling water for a compress for a child who has been feverish since morning. Down on the Mersey, the ebb tide is running out fast, and the ships at anchor are all pointing their bows the same way. At number 20, Anne Hinrichsen has lit a lamp in the parlour. The card is still in the window. Mary has come down from the top floor and set the table for supper. The two boys have been washed and put into their nightshirts. Outside on the pavement, the passers-by are hurrying home in the last of the wet grey light. None of them look up as a man in a dark coat walks slowly past the front of the house, and slows a little, and glances at the card in the window, and walks on. Not tonight, but soon. The notice in the window. Come with me to the parlour window at number 20, on a plain grey morning, some days before our story turns its worst corner. The card is still there in the lower pane, where Mary set it the week before. 3 words in a neat hand. Furnished lodgings. Enquire within. The ink has faded a little from the sun, though there has not been much sun. The card itself has curled at one corner from the damp that always found its way through the sash frames of Liverpool houses in that season. I want you to stand on the pavement with me for a moment and read that card the way a passer-by would have read it. Not as a warning, not as an omen. As what it was. A woman was letting a room, and she was hoping a decent sort of person would notice. The letting of a room was one of the small trades of the age. A great many households in the middling streets did it, at some point in their lives, and thought nothing of it. A daughter married and moved away, and her bedroom stood empty. A husband was posted overseas with his regiment, and his study was no longer used. A mother was widowed and could not quite meet the rent by herself. In each case, a card went into the window, or a notice was placed in the Liverpool Mercury or the Albion, and within a week or two a lodger was found. The lodger paid, in that year, somewhere between 8 and 15 shillings a week, depending on the room, the meals and the fire. To a family paying £25 a year in rent for a terrace house, an extra 10 shillings a week was a real ease. Anne Hinrichsen had turned the notion over through the winter. The record does not tell us in her own words when she first considered it, and I will not put a sentence into her mouth that she never said. What we do know is what any woman in her place would have weighed. She had 2 young children and a third on the way. Her husband was months out at sea and would not answer a letter before summer. The captain of a merchant vessel earned a respectable living, but he was paid in lump sums at the end of a voyage, not in a weekly wage, and between one voyage and the next a wife had to manage on what remained. The bills came anyway. Coal was 2 shillings and sixpence the hundredweight that spring. A leg of mutton for a Sunday dinner cost 4 shillings. The rates and the water and the gas were due at their own hard corners of the year. A lodger's 10 shillings a week would have covered the coal and the meat, and left a little over for a new pair of shoes for Henry, whose old ones had begun to pinch. That was one side of it. There was another. A strange man in a house of women and children was not a matter to be taken up without thought. A lodger came in through the front door in the morning and went up his own staircase to his own room and shut his own door at night, and for weeks at a time you saw only the top of his hat over the banister. You heard his boots on the boards above your ceiling. You smelled the pipe he liked to smoke before bed. He sat at your table for breakfast and for supper. He took his tea in your parlour. He learned, by living there, the hours you kept and the friends you had and the rooms you slept in. That was the plain fact of taking in a boarder. You gave a stranger the run of your house. Most women in Anne Hinrichson's position managed the risk in one of 2 ways. Either they let the room only to a person they already knew of, through a family friend or a church connection, or they insisted on a written character from a previous landlady or an employer. A character was a plain letter, sometimes only 3 lines long, saying that the bearer had lodged with the writer for so many months, and had paid his rent on the day, and had given no trouble in the house. In that year such a letter meant something. A man without one was not refused out of hand, but he was looked at more carefully, and asked more questions, and often shown the door with a polite word about the room being spoken for. We do not know for certain which of these 2 doors Anne Hinrichson intended to hold open. The record on her exact intentions is thin, and I want to be honest about that with you rather than paper over it. What is certain is that the card went into the window in the middle of March, and that in the days that followed, a small number of callers came up the stone steps to knock. Let us stand on the pavement a while longer, and watch a few of them come and go. The first, on the day the card first appeared, was an elderly clerk from one of the shipping firms on Water Street. He was a widower. He wanted a room within walking distance of his office. Mary let him into the front hall, and Anne came out from the parlour and spoke to him for perhaps a quarter of an hour, and thanked him and said she would send word. She did not send word. The parlour was too small for a permanent guest, and the room on the first floor she meant to let was, in the end, too dear for him. A day or 2 later a young Welshman knocked. He was a junior clerk in a counting house on Castle Street, and he had walked all the way up from Chapel Street on a wet morning with his shoes soaked through. He had a letter from his employer folded inside his coat. Anne took the letter and read it by the parlour lamp, and said the room was still to be decided upon. He touched the brim of his hat and went away, and I do not know what became of him, and no one now does. It is one of those small threads history does not follow. 2 or 3 others came, in the way of any card in a window in that town. A retired sea captain, too old to be at sea any more, who wanted a room with a view of the river, which number 20 did not have. A young widow with a child, whom Anne was gentler with than the others but could not take, because the house was full enough already. A commercial traveller in cloth, who was in Liverpool only 2 nights a week, and wanted the room kept for him on the other 5 for a lower rate, which Anne politely refused. None of them were the man we are waiting for. Come away from the front of the house now, and let me take you round to the back for a few minutes, because I want you to see the small business of the household through Mary's eyes as well. She was up before the rest of the house each morning. She raked the ash from the kitchen range and laid the new fire. She carried the ash pail out to the yard. She drew water from the tap in the scullery, which was one of the first taps of piped water in a house on that street, and boiled a kettle on the range for Anne's tea. She swept the front step. She scrubbed the flags of the pavement outside the railings. That was the first hour of her day, before the boys were awake. When the card had gone into the window, Mary had been told what to do if a caller came while Anne was upstairs with the children. She was to open the door, ask the caller his business politely, take his card if he had one, and show him into the parlour, and then fetch her mistress. She was not to speak of the family's affairs. She was not to say when the master would return. She was not to say how many people slept in the house. Those were the plain instructions any respectable mistress gave a young servant in that year, and Anne was a plain and respectable mistress, and Mary was a careful girl. There is nothing in the record to suggest she ever slipped from those instructions. Whatever it was that brought our man to the door in the end, it was not gossip from Mary Parr. Now let us go back to the pavement one last time, because the man himself is very close now, and I want you to see him with me before he becomes only a name in a report. He came down Great George Street from the north on a grey afternoon in the last week of March. What he was wearing on that first pass is not perfectly certain, and the accounts of witnesses given later at the trial did not always agree with one another, and I do not want to invent a coat for him. What is certain is that he was a young man, in his middle 20s, of medium height and strong build, with dark hair and a fair complexion, and a manner in his walk that struck at least one person as steady rather than hurried. He turned into Leveson Street at the corner. He walked along the pavement on the same side as number 20. He slowed as he came to the bow window. He read the card. He did not knock that afternoon. He kept walking. At the end of the terrace he crossed the street and came back on the other side, and glanced once more at the front of the house from the far pavement, and went on his way toward the town. We do not know where he went that evening. He gave, later, 3 or 4 accounts of his movements in those days, and none of them held up under questioning. He may have gone back to a lodging house in the North End, in one of the crowded streets behind the docks, where a bed cost 4pence, and no landlord asked for a true name. He may have gone to a public house on Paradise Street for a plate of boiled mutton and a jug of beer. He may have sat, for an hour, on a bench near the Exchange, watching the merchants and the clerks come out of the counting houses at the end of their day. All of that is guesswork, and I will not sell you guesswork as fact. What is certain is only that he had seen the card, and that he came back. He came back the following day, or perhaps the day after that. The exact hour is not fixed in the record, and I would rather leave it a little loose than invent a precision the sources do not support. It was still afternoon, and it was still grey, and the pavement was still slick with the sort of thin wet that Liverpool wore all through that spring. This time he did not walk past. He stopped at the foot of the stone steps of number 20. He looked for a moment up at the fanlight above the door. He read the card in the window one more time. Then he climbed the 3 steps and lifted the brass knocker. You have to imagine now, with your eyes closed, how that knock sounded inside the house. Mary was in the back kitchen, kneading a loaf on the deal board, her hands white to the wrist with flour. Anne was on the first landing, folding a pile of clean linen into the airing cupboard. Henry was in the parlour on the rug. Little John was asleep in the small chair by the fire. The knock came clean and firm through the front door and travelled up the stairwell. Mary wiped her hands on the towel by the range and came down the passage to the hall. I have to leave you here, for tonight, on that side of the door, before it opens. I know it is hard. Believe me, I know. But every serious history of this case pauses, at this exact hour, because what happens next changes the light on everything that came before it. What we know for certain of the man on the step is that he gave a name to Mary, and the name he gave was not the name he had been born with. What we know of Anne is that she came down into the parlour some minutes later and spoke with him there, and asked the questions any careful mistress would ask. What we know of the room is that he took it. What we know of the household is that by the evening of that day there was one more place set at the supper table, and one more candle to be lit at the top of the stairs. Beyond that, the record grows both fuller and darker. The parlour conversation between Anne and the stranger was witnessed by no one who lived to describe it. 2 neighbours later remembered seeing a man come and go from the door of number 20 in the days that followed, and they gave slightly different accounts of him, and both were certain. The Hinrichsen family's own voices are gone, all 4 of them, and everything we now say about those quiet days between the taking of the room and the afternoon of the killings is stitched together from the small marks the household left in the wider world. We will follow those marks together in the chapter to come. For now, stay a moment longer on the pavement with me, in the last hour before that door opened. The gas has not yet been lit on the corner. The grocer 3 doors down is bringing in his crate of cabbages from the flagstones for the night. A cart has stopped further along the street to unload a barrel of ale for the public house on the corner of Great George Street. Somewhere above your head, a window is quietly closed. The rain, which has held off all afternoon, begins again, so fine that you can only feel it on your face and not see it in the air. At number 20, the knocker falls once against the brass plate, and the last calm afternoon of that house begins, at last, to end. The caller at the door. Mary opened the door. She had wiped the flour from her hands on her apron and come down the passage as she had been taught, without hurry and without dawdling, and she lifted the latch and drew the door back to the length of her arm. The man on the step took a pace backward as she did so, which was the mark of a person with manners, and he touched the brim of his hat to her, which was another. He said, "Good afternoon." He asked, in a voice she later described as steady and civil, whether the lodgings advertised in the parlour window were still to be had. The record does not tell us the exact words he used. Only their shape survives through Mary Parr herself, who gave 2 brief accounts of that first meeting before she died, and through the man's own later attempts to describe himself in court, which were mostly lies. What is fixed in the record is the name he gave. He said his name was John Wilson. He said he had lately come from Limerick, in the west of Ireland, by way of Dublin, and had crossed the Channel a fortnight before, and was looking for a settled room while he found employment in the town. He said he was a bookkeeper by training, and had a little money by him from a former situation. He was polite, he was neatly turned out, and he had the manner of a man who was used to speaking with servants. Mary asked him to wait a moment on the step. She closed the door on the latch, not on the bolt, and she went up the passage to the foot of the stairs, and she called to her mistress that a caller had come about the room. "Come away from the hall with me for a breath. There is something you have to know before we listen to the parlour, and I would rather tell it to you now than let it sit behind a closed door for another chapter." The name he gave was not the name he had been born with. He had been baptised in a parish register in the west of Ireland, Maurice Gleeson. He had come to England some years earlier and had passed under several names in the ports of Lancashire, and had used at least 2 of them long enough that a policeman in Manchester and a policeman in Preston each had a file with a different set of letters on the spine. John Wilson was one of the names he had already used in a boarding house up in the north end of Liverpool, not 2 miles from where he now stood, and it was the name he kept for the door of number 20. Why he chose that name for that afternoon, rather than another, is not something the record explains. Perhaps it was the first thing that came to his tongue. Perhaps he liked the ordinariness of it. Perhaps he had already decided that it would be his name in this street for the few days he meant to be in it. That, in any case, is the name Anne Hinrichsen heard from her servant at the foot of the stairs. She came down. Anne had finished folding the linen, and she had settled the older boy at the table with a picture book, and she had listened for a moment at the door of the room where the younger one was asleep, and she had come down the flight in the way of a woman who is trying to hurry and not seem to. In the parlour, she straightened the edge of the tablecloth as she passed. She lifted the door latch and stepped through. Here I have to slow us again, because everything about the next quarter of an hour is important, and almost none of it was written down at the time. No third person was in that room. Mary went back to the kitchen, because that was where a servant belonged, and closed the door behind her, because that was what a well-trained servant did when the mistress had a caller. The children were upstairs and along the passage. The neighbours in the houses to either side heard nothing through the party walls, or at least remembered nothing later. What we know of the conversation between Anne Hinrichsen and the man who called himself John Wilson comes only from what happened afterward. She let him the room. He moved in his trunk. He took his meals at her table. Beyond that, the parlour is a closed door in the record, and I would rather admit that to you than pretend I can see through it. What I can tell you is what a woman of her position would have asked, that afternoon, of any stranger who wanted to sleep under her roof. She would have asked his trade, and he would have said bookkeeping, as he had already said on the step. She would have asked whether he had a character from a former employer or a former landlady, and here the record is more interesting, because he seems to have offered her one, and it seems to have satisfied her, and no one has ever known whether it was a true letter or a piece of paper he had written for himself in a lodging house the night before. She would have asked how long he wished the room for, and he would have said, in the way men in his position always said, only for a few weeks, until his affairs were settled. She would have named the rent. He would have agreed to it. He would have paid her, out of a purse or a pocketbook, the first week in advance. And she would have shown him the room upstairs and given him a key to the front door. The rent was, in that year, the ordinary rent for such a room in such a street. The record puts it at a little under 12 shillings a week, with breakfast and supper included, and the use of the parlour in the evenings if he wished it, which was the arrangement most middling houses in Liverpool offered a lodger of his class. He counted the coins onto the parlour table. She wrote him a receipt in the household book. He touched his hat again. He went out, and that, so far as the pavement was concerned, was the whole of the matter. Later that afternoon he came back with his trunk. It was not a heavy trunk. A boy from the corner helped him carry it up the front steps for a penny, and the boy remembered nothing else about him afterward, except that he had a fair complexion and did not speak on the pavement. The trunk went up the stairs to the room on the first floor at the back, which was the room Anne had decided to let. Inside stood a bed of iron, made up with fresh sheets and a bolster, and a washstand with a jug and basin of white china, and a chair, and a strip of carpet on the boards, and a fireplace that had been swept but not laid. One window looked down into the paved yard behind the house, and past the yard to the brick backs of the houses on the next street. It was fitted with a plain white blind on a wooden roller. He drew the blind halfway down, set his trunk against the wall, and came back down to take his tea. At the supper table that first evening, he sat where the master of the house would have sat if the master had been home, because that was the empty chair. Henry, who was 5, watched him across the tablecloth with the openness of a boy who has been well loved and is not yet afraid of strangers. Little John, who was 3, was too young to sit at the table properly, and took his supper of bread and milk in the high chair by the fire. Mary carried in the dishes. Anne poured the tea, and the man who called himself John Wilson ate a plate of cold mutton and pickle and a piece of bread with butter, and drank 2 cups of tea, and answered the questions Anne asked him about Ireland with the ease of a person who had told those particular lies many times before. Come with me out of the dining room for a moment. I want you to understand, before we go any further, that nothing at that supper table looked wrong. Nothing sounded wrong. He did not stare. He did not press his hand to the boy's cheek in a way a mother would remember. He did not ask about the master's ship, or when the master might be expected home, or whether the master left money in the house between his voyages. Those are the questions a person planning what he was planning is supposed, in the storybooks, to ask. He asked none of them. He talked about the weather across the sea. He said the crossing had been rougher than he had expected for the season. He said Dublin had grown a great deal since he had last seen it. He praised the mutton. He asked, when the meal was done, whether he might sit in the parlour for an hour with the newspaper, and Anne said of course he might, and he did, and he read the Liverpool Mercury by the parlour lamp until the clock in the hall struck 9, and then he took his candle from the sideboard and went up to bed. He was, by every account we have of him from that first day, an unremarkable lodger. That is the peace I want you to hold. A great many of the newspapers that later wrote up this case, and a great many of the pamphlets that were sold in the streets in the summer that followed, tried very hard to paint the man on the step as an obvious wolf who had somehow tricked a foolish woman into opening her door. He was not that. Anne Hinrichsen was not that. She was a mistress in a respectable street, doing every reasonable thing a woman of her station was expected to do before she gave a stranger her key. She had asked for a character. She had heard him at her table for a full evening. She had watched him with her children in the room. Nothing in the man she saw across her tea that first night told her what he was. That is one of the hard truths this case leaves behind, and I do not want to file it away too easily. Real evil does not always announce itself at the door. The days that followed are thin in the record, and I have to be honest about that. We have only a handful of marks left by them. The grocer 3 doors down remembered the new lodger coming in on the second morning for a paper of tobacco. The maid of the house next door saw him leave by the front door around 10 o'clock, on more than one morning, and return, sometimes, in the middle of the afternoon. A woman who kept a chandler's shop at the corner of Great George Street remembered him buying a length of clothesline and paying with a shilling, though the exact date of that visit she was afterward unsure about. He took his breakfast in the house and his supper in the house. Where he took his midday meal is not known. On the Monday of the second week, he gave Anne another 12 shillings for a further week's rent, and she wrote it in the household book in the same even hand as the first entry. For most of that week, there was nothing to see. Anne kept house. She wrote a long letter to her husband in her round, even hand, and gave it to Mary to take to the post. In that letter she mentioned, halfway down the second page, that she had taken a lodger, and that he seemed a decent young man, and that the extra 10 shillings a week would be a help against the coal bill. That letter reached her husband's ship weeks later, at a port on the far side of the world, and was one of the things put in front of him when he was told what had happened. It is one of the most terrible short documents in the whole of this case, because it is so ordinary. She was not afraid of the man in her upstairs room. She had no reason to be. Henry played in the yard when the weather allowed, and inside when it did not. Little John toddled after his brother in the passage, in the way of a child of that age, and had to be lifted over the doorstep. Mary rose before the rest of the house, and laid the fires, and drew the water, and swept the front step, and folded the master's shirts against his return. In the room on the first floor at the back, the man who called himself John Wilson slept, and rose and dressed and went out, and came back, and slept again, for a full week and then most of a second one. On the last ordinary afternoon of number 20 Leveson Street, the sky over Liverpool was the same thin grey it had been all through that spring. A wind was coming up off the river from the west, and it smelled of salt and coal smoke together. In the parlour the fire was burning low, because coal had to be watched, and Anne was watching it. In the kitchen Mary had put a kettle on the hob, and was standing at the deal board slicing a loaf for the boys' tea. The two children were on the rug in front of the parlour fire, with a set of wooden animals a neighbour had given them at Christmas. Henry was arranging the animals in a line. Little John was trying to knock them down. At about 3 in the afternoon, a step sounded in the passage above them. The lodger was coming down the stairs, one tread at a time, in the way any man comes down a staircase in his own house. He crossed the hall. He stood for a moment in the parlour door. He said something pleasant to the older boy about the wooden animals. He asked Anne whether she might spare him a jug of hot water from the kettle, to shave with, before he went out again. Anne said of course. Mary was called. Mary took a jug from the shelf and poured the water and carried it up the stairs after him. The parlour clock struck the quarter hour. Somewhere out in the street a cart went by with a load of coal, and the driver called to his horse, and the horse blew a long breath through its nose, and the noise faded away down toward the town. Rain began again on the parlour window, so fine you could barely hear it against the glass. And in the ordinary business of that hour, without any warning the record has preserved, the last afternoon of the Hinrichsen household ran itself out. The hour of the kettle. Come with me to the foot of the stairs one more time. I know what is above us in this chapter, and I know what you have come here for, and I want to be honest with you about the shape of the hour before we go into it. The record of what happened in the parlour and on the staircase of number 20 Leveson Street between the striking of the 3:15 and the hour of 4 in the afternoon of the 28th of March, 1849, is preserved almost entirely through the plain language of the coroner's inquest, the deposition of one witness who lived long enough to give it, and the marks the killer left on the walls and the floor and the door frames of the house. That is what we have, and it is all we have, and no writer since has been able to add a single certain word to it. I am going to tell you what those records say, and no more. I will not invent a scream. I will not invent a plea. Where the sources are silent, we will be silent with them, and let that silence do its work. The kettle on the kitchen hob was still just off the boil. Mary carried the jug up the first flight, and along the landing to the room at the back. She knocked once. She heard him say to come in. She opened the door only as far as she needed to. He was standing near the washstand with his back half turned to her, in his shirt sleeves. She set the jug on the top of the washstand beside the china basin. He thanked her. She said supper would be laid at 6. He nodded. She went out and closed the door behind her, and went back down the stairs to the kitchen, where the loaf was still waiting for her on the deal board. Somewhere in the 10 minutes that followed, the man who called himself John Wilson came out of that room. We do not know what he was thinking as he stood on the landing. We do not know at what moment in the days before that afternoon he had decided the thing he was about to do, or whether he had decided it days before, or only on the stair. 2 later confessions were pulled from him, and both were mostly lies, and the one piece of either that a court believed was that he had come to the house for what money the house contained. £12 in silver, some suggested. Others said less. A watch. A pair of gold earrings a widow had given Anne when Henry was born. That was the size of the thing he had come to the door for. That was the shape of it. Hold that in your mind, if you can, and hold it lightly, because it is the only part of this that has anything you could call a reason. He came down the stairs without hurry. So far as we can tell, he made no sound the servant would have marked. The children, on the rug in front of the parlour fire, would have heard only the ordinary tread of the lodger on the boards above their heads, and then the ordinary tread of the lodger coming down. Anne, in her chair by the parlour window, would have looked up when he stepped through the parlour door, because that was what any hostess did. Perhaps she smiled at him. Perhaps she said something about the rain. Perhaps she said nothing at all, and only met his eye. The record does not preserve the last sentence Anne Hinrichsen ever spoke, and I will not fill in a sentence for her. What is certain is that within a very few minutes of his coming into the parlour, she was on the floor, and she was no longer living, and the 2 boys were beside her. Let me set down what the coroner's men found, and no more. They found Anne Hinrichsen in the parlour, near the hearth, with her clothing disordered and with wounds to her head and throat that had been made with 2 different implements, one of which appeared to be a kitchen poker taken from the parlour fire irons, and one of which was a shorter blade of the kind kept in the scullery. She had been struck first, and she had fallen, and she had not risen. The child John, who was 3 years old, was found close to her, in a way that suggested he had gone to her when she fell, and had not moved from her afterward. Henry, who was 5, was found a little further off, near the parlour door, which was the door he would have run for. The pattern of the wounds on the children was of a kind the coroner's man had no easy words for, and used the fewest words he could. The parlour clock, which had struck the 3:15 when the lodger asked for his jug of water, was later found to have stopped at some minutes before 4, though whether it stopped from the vibration of what happened in the room, or from being knocked in the moving of the furniture, no one could ever be sure. I will not sit us in that parlour any longer than that. The record does not ask us to, and I do not think you came here for it. Come out of the parlour with me. Come back into the passage. Mary was still in the kitchen. The kettle had gone silent because the fire had died back a little under the range, and she had lifted it off the hob and set it on the trivet. She was slicing the loaf. The corridor between the kitchen and the parlour was short, and the door to the parlour was heavy, and the sounds that had come through that door in the last few minutes had been sounds Mary was afterward not able, in her own words, to fully describe. She had heard a fall. She had heard, she thought, one of the boys cry out, and then a second cry, and then no more. She had set down the bread knife. She had wiped her hands on her apron. She had come out into the corridor and taken 2 or 3 steps toward the parlour door. She never reached it. Here we have, in fact, more of the record than for any other moment of that hour, because Mary Parr lived. She did not live long, but she lived long enough to be lifted from the floor of that corridor by the first neighbours through the door, and carried across the road to a house where a doctor was fetched, and to speak, in the 2 days that followed, a handful of short sentences to the police officer who sat by her bed. What she was able to say was this: she had come out of the kitchen. She had seen a man in the corridor between her and the parlour door. She had not at first understood that it was the lodger, because his shirt was no longer a shirt she recognised. She had put up her hands. He had struck her once, twice, more than twice, with something short and heavy that she thought afterward had been the poker from the parlour hearth. though she was not certain, and I will be honest with you and say she was not certain. She had fallen. She had felt him step over her. She had heard the front door open. She had heard it close. She had not lost her senses at once, but she had lost the use of her limbs, and she had lain in the corridor between the kitchen and the parlour, alone in a house where no one else was living any more, for a length of time she was afterward not able to measure. That is all Mary Parr was ever able to say of that afternoon. It is a great deal, in the circumstances, and it is what allowed a jury, some months later, to know for certain what a court is asked to know. But it is not much for a young woman to leave of herself in the record of the world, and I want us to sit with that plainly for a moment before we go on. Come with me back to the door. The man who called himself John Wilson stood on the step of number 20 for the last time at some minutes past 4 in the afternoon. He had changed neither his coat nor his hat. In the parlour he had taken from Anne Hinrickson's chatelaine a ring of keys, and had opened, upstairs, the writing desk in her bedroom, and had taken from a drawer a leather purse containing some silver and 1 or 2 pieces of gold. From a jewel box beside the desk he had taken a plain gold watch and chain that had belonged to Anne's father, a pair of gold earrings, and a mourning brooch of black enamel. He had wrapped these in a cotton handkerchief and put the handkerchief in his coat pocket. He had washed his hands in the basin in his own room at the back of the first floor, in the same jug of water Mary had carried up to him a little more than half an hour before. He had changed his shirt and had rolled the shirt he had been wearing into a bundle, and had left the bundle behind the door of his room, where the police would find it that same evening. Then he had come down the stairs and along the corridor, past the body of the young woman who was still just barely living in front of the kitchen door, and had opened the front door of number 20, and had stepped out onto the top step. The rain had thickened a little. A cart was going along the street at the far end, toward the market. A curtain moved in the front window of a house across the road, though whoever had looked out afterward remembered only that a young man in a dark coat had come down the steps of number 20 and turned toward Great George Street. He did not run. He did not look back. He walked, at the pace of a person with no particular business, to the corner. He turned. He was gone. Inside number 20, the parlour fire burned low on the grate. The kettle sat on the trivet in the scullery. The bread lay half-sliced on the deal board. The wooden animals lay tumbled on the rug. In the corridor, Mary Parr was breathing very shallowly and could not call out. In the parlour, 3 of the 4 people who had been living in that house at the striking of the 3:15 were living no longer. Above them, on the first floor at the back, the blind was still drawn halfway down in the lodger's room, and the jug on the washstand was empty, and the fire in the fireplace had not been lit that day and would not be lit again. Come away from the front of the house with me. Come out onto the pavement. Come across the road with me a little way, and stand a moment where a neighbour would have stood. From the outside, at some minutes past 4 in the afternoon of that Wednesday, number 20 Leveson Street looked exactly like every other house on that side of the street. The front door was closed. The card was still in the window of the parlour. The blind on the upstairs back room, which no one in the street could see anyway, was still drawn halfway down. Smoke was still rising, very thinly, from the parlour chimney, because the fire had not yet burned itself out. A person walking past on the pavement at that hour would have had no idea at all that anything was wrong. That is one of the hard shapes of this history, and I want to give it to you as it was. A great crime does not always announce itself to the street. The world outside is often exactly as it was 10 minutes before. It is one of the reasons cases of this sort haunted the town so deeply afterward. The ordinariness of the pavement, in the hour after the door closed, was worse in memory than any noise would have been. The first person to come to the door of number 20 after the lodger left it was not, in the end, a neighbour, but a boy from the corner grocer with a paper of tea and a paper of sugar that Anne had ordered the day before and had asked to have brought round at 4. He climbed the 3 steps. He lifted the brass knocker. He let it fall. He waited. He knocked again. He waited a little longer. He set the papers down on the top step, because that was what he had been told to do if no one answered, and he went back down to the pavement, and he went on his way. It was one of the ordinary rounds of his afternoon, and he thought no more of it. The rain thickened again. The gas lamps at the ends of the street were lit, one by one, by the lamplighter, in the order he always lit them. Somewhere in the town, along a street that led toward the docks, a man in a dark coat was walking with his hands in his pockets and a bundle in one of them, and he was already thinking about which pawn shop, at which corner, might take a gold watch without asking too many questions of the man who brought it in. And in the corridor of number 20, in the failing grey light, a young woman lay very still with her eyes half open, listening, without any way of calling out, for the first friendly step upon the front stone. What the neighbours heard. Come back to Leveson Street with me. It is nearly 7 in the evening now, and the light on the pavement has gone the colour of wet slate, and the lamplighter has been down the row and back, so the street is lit at its two ends and dark in its middle. I want you to stand with me across the road, on the opposite pavement for a moment. Not long, just long enough to notice that the front door of number 20 is still closed, and the card is still in the window, and the blind of the parlour has not been drawn, though every other blind on that side of the street has. The first person to feel that something in the house was wrong was not the neighbour to either side, and not the constable at the end of the beat, but a woman named Margaret Hughes, who kept house at number 22, directly next door. She had known Anne Hinrichsen for something over a year. They had passed the time of day at their front steps most mornings. They had, on one or two occasions, taken tea together. Margaret had a boy of Henry's age, and the two boys had played in the backyards on Sundays. At a little before 7 that evening, Margaret came out of number 22 to shake a tablecloth over the railing. She glanced along the pavement, as one does, and saw the papers of tea and sugar still sitting on the top step of number 20. She thought little of it at first. A parcel left an hour was a parcel a servant had missed. A parcel still there at 7 was a different matter. She dropped her cloth over the railing. She came a few paces along the pavement. She lifted the papers off the step, because rain had come and gone, and she did not want good tea to spoil for a friend. She knocked at the door. No one came. She waited. She knocked again, louder, in the way one does when one is beginning to be uneasy but does not yet want to admit it. She listened at the wood. She thought, she said afterward, that she heard a very faint sound from within, though she could not be sure, and she was for the rest of her life uncertain whether she had heard anything at all or had imagined it in the light of what came after. She went back to her own step. She called her husband to the door. I will keep the husband nameless for a line, because that is how the newspapers of the time have him, and because his part in this is short. He was a joiner by trade, a man used to doors and hinges and locks, and he came out onto his own step in his waistcoat and looked across at number 20, and rang the bell there himself, and knocked, and then went back into his own hallway for a lever from his tool chest. It was another neighbour, from number 18 on the other side, who ran to the end of the street for a constable. And it was that constable, a man named John Roberts of the Liverpool Borough Force, who arrived on the pavement at a few minutes past 7, and, after listening at the door for himself, and hearing what he later described as a low, intermittent moan from the corridor within, gave the joiner leave to force the lock. The door came open on the second heave of the lever. "Come inside with me, but only as far as the front hall. That is as far as I mean to take you tonight." The lamp in the hall was not lit. The passage was dim and cooler than a lived-in passage should be. The parlour door was ajar. From the parlour came the last thin wash of light from a fire that had almost gone out on the grate. And on the boards of the corridor between the parlour door and the kitchen door, in the half-dark, lay Mary Parr. She was breathing. That was the first thing the constable saw, and he said afterward that he had never in his life been so glad to see a person breathing. She was on her side. Her apron was dark. Her cap had come off and was on the boards near her head. Her eyes were open, and she looked at him, and she moved her lips, and he could not at first make out what she was trying to say. The joiner from next door lifted her, with the help of his own wife, who had by now crossed the road. They carried her out through the front door and across to number 22. A doctor was fetched from Great George Street. He came within a quarter of an hour. He was a man who had seen a good deal in his years of practice in that district, and he was not easily shaken. But when he came out of Margaret Hughes's back parlour later that evening, he stood on her step for a long moment before he could speak to the constable, and when he did speak, he said only that the injuries were of a kind for which he could do very little, and that the girl might last a day, or she might last 2, but she would not last longer. She lasted, in the end, 2 days and a piece of a third. While the doctor was still bent over Mary in Margaret Hughes's back parlour, other men had gone into number 20. Constable Roberts had gone in first, with his lamp lifted. Behind him had come a sergeant from the same station. Behind them had come, at a decent distance, 2 of the neighbours from further along the street, who had been sent for because they were known to have kept their heads in bad situations before. None of them, in later years, was ever willing to describe in full what was found in the parlour of number 20 at a little after 7 o'clock on the evening of the 28th of March, 1849. The sergeant, when he was made to give evidence at the trial, gave the shortest account a court has ever accepted. 3 persons dead. A mother. 2 children of tender years. The parlour disordered. That was the whole of it. He would not be pressed further, and the counsel who was pressing him did not press him again. I will not press him further either. What we have is enough for the record, and more than enough for the ear. The constable went upstairs. On the first floor, at the back, he found the lodger's room, and in the lodger's room he found the door standing open, and on the floor behind the door he found a bundled shirt that was no longer white, and on the washstand he found a china jug that was empty, and a basin whose water had been changed and was still faintly pink. The trunk was against the wall under the window. Inside the trunk were 2 spare shirts, a pair of stockings, a razor in a leather case, and a book of psalms in which no name had been written. In the top drawer of the chest by the bed was a piece of paper on which a name and a date had been written in a hand that looked practised and not hurried. John Wilson, late of Limerick, come to Liverpool the 12th day of March, 1849. Nothing else. That piece of paper, when it was brought down to the station house that night, was the whole of what the Liverpool Borough Police had to begin their work with. A written name they already had reason to suspect was false. A town in Ireland he was almost certainly not from. A date that might or might not be true. A shirt, a razor, a book of psalms, and a young woman across the road who was not able to sit up or speak more than a few words at a time. Come outside with me again for a moment, into the street, because I want you to understand the shape of the evening from the pavement. By 8 o'clock, the news had begun to move. It moved first house by house along Leveson Street itself, so that within the hour every household on both sides of the street had heard some version of what was in the parlour of number 20, most of them wilder than the truth. It moved from Leveson Street to the surrounding streets on the tongues of servants sent out for the doctor, for the priest, for a policeman's wife, for a bottle of brandy. It reached the Great George Street public house before 9, and from there it was in the taverns along the docks by 10. By midnight, in the low common lodging houses at the north end of the town, men who had never heard of the Hinrichsen family were already telling one another that a whole household in a respectable street had been butchered by an Irishman. The word Irishman is one I have to set down carefully. Liverpool in that year was a town in which every 3rd or 4th face on the pavement was newly arrived from Ireland, driven across the water by the famine and by everything that had followed it. The English population of the town had already by then worked itself into a settled prejudice against those arrivals, and any crime with an Irish name attached to it lit up that prejudice at once. Within days, the pamphlets sold on the corners were speaking of the killer as a fair specimen of his race, and within weeks the phrase Irish murderer was fixed to his name in a way that no later court, and no later evidence, and no later reflection has ever fully unfastened. It is one of the ugly shadows this case cast. I mention it now, at the point where the news began to move, so that you know it is there, and so that we can be watchful together, as the story goes on, of what belongs to the man himself, and what belongs to the prejudice of the town. In Margaret Hughes's back parlour, meanwhile, Mary Parr was slipping in and out of what the doctor called sensibility. She could not sit up. She could take a little water from a spoon. She could open her eyes and close them again. When Constable Roberts came across from number 20 at some time before 10 that first evening, and knelt by the couch on which she had been laid, and asked her, as tenderly as he was able, whether she could tell him who had done this, she looked at him for a long time before she answered. She said one word. She said Wilson. Then she closed her eyes and turned her face a little toward the wall, and the doctor put his hand on the constable's arm and drew him back. That single word, spoken from a couch in a neighbour's back parlour at 10 o'clock at night, was the first thread the Liverpool police had that led anywhere. It was a name, and it was a false name, and everyone in that room already suspected as much. But it was a place to begin. The following morning, at first light, they began. I have to give you one honest note before we go on. Mary Parr, in the 2 days that followed, gave 3 short statements to the officer who sat by her bed, and no 2 of them were exactly alike. She was young. She was in great pain. She had been carried in and out of consciousness by turns for hours at a stretch. She was being questioned in a stranger's house by a stranger about the worst afternoon of her life. That her 3 statements do not perfectly agree is not a mark against her, and no serious writer since has ever treated it as one. What is remarkable is not the little differences between them, but the shape they share. In each, she said she had come out of the kitchen. In each, she said she had seen a man in the corridor. In each, she named him. In each, she said he had struck her from the front, and struck her more than once, and stepped over her, and gone out through the front door. That is the shape of what she left. It is the deposition of Mary Parr, and it is one of the reasons a jury, some months later, was able to be sure. She died in Margaret Hughes's back parlour at some hour in the afternoon of the 30th of March, 1849. The record does not preserve which hour. The doctor was with her at the end. A minister of her own faith had been fetched to her the day before. She was, at that time, 21 years of age. Her family lived in a village in the northwest of Ireland, and were reached by letter some weeks afterward, and she was buried, before they could arrive, in a plot in a churchyard on the edge of the town, at the expense of a fund raised among the residents of Leveson Street and Great George Street in the days after her death. Her name is not, at the time I am telling you this, on any monument in the city. I have stood at the wall of that churchyard on a summer evening. It is a green square between 2 rows of brick. It is very ordinary. I would rather you did not go looking for it. Back on Leveson Street, in the days that followed, the front door of number 20 stayed closed, and a constable stood on the top step in a rain cape whenever the weather was against him, and the card in the parlour window, which had said "Furnished lodgings and Enquire within," was taken down by someone whose name has not come down to us, and folded and put away. In the parlour, the fire had long since gone out, and no one relit it. In the kitchen, the bread on the deal board had gone hard. In the corridor, the boards had been scrubbed, though not so thoroughly that anyone who had seen them that first evening was ever able, in later life, to walk over them again without pausing. And across the town, along the docks and out through the lodging streets and into every low room where a stranger might take a bed, another kind of movement had already begun. A man in a dark coat, with a bundle in his pocket and a false name in his mouth, had been walking since a little past 4 on the afternoon of the 28th, and by the time the sun rose on the 29th, he had a full night's start, and by the time Mary Parr closed her eyes for the last time in Margaret Hughes's back parlour, he was no longer in the town at all. Where he had gone, and by which streets, and under which name, was, at that hour, the whole business of the Liverpool Borough Force. And it is with them, at the corner of a pawnshop counter in a narrow lane behind the docks, that our next hour begins. The hunt along the docks. Come with me down toward the water, because that is where the town's police work began the next morning, and that is where we have to begin too. The sky over Liverpool on the 29th of March was low and the colour of pewter, and there was a wind coming in off the river that carried the smell of tar and of wet rope and of the coal smoke from the ferry boilers. The dock road was already awake. Carts were rolling along the sets with barrels of pitch, and gangs of dock hands were moving along the quays in their moleskin trousers, and out on the water, the Birkenhead ferry was making its first crossing of the morning, with its funnel gouting black. The Liverpool Borough Force in that year was a young thing. It had been founded only 13 years before, in 1836, and most of the men who wore its dark tunic were themselves men who could remember a Liverpool that had no uniformed police at all. They numbered, in the whole of the town, something over 800, which sounds a great many until you stand on the dock road on a Thursday morning and try to count the strangers passing on the pavement. Their headquarters was in a building off Dale Street. Their weapon was a wooden staff. Their light, after dark, was a bull's-eye lantern with a horn slide. They were, as a body of men, brave and undertrained and often tired, and they were the whole of what stood between the town and the sort of afternoon that had happened, the day before, in the parlour of number 20. The superintendent who took the case in hand was a man named Michael Whitty. He had been an officer of the borough force since its earliest years, and he was a corkman by birth, which is worth noting because so much of what he was about to do rested on his knowing, by ear, the accents of the country the killer had come from. He was in his early 40s. He wore side whiskers and a dark stock. On the morning of the 29th of March, he was at the station house before the gaslight in the office had been turned down, and by the time the street lamps along Dale Street were going out, he had already sent messengers to every one of the 4 dockside divisions with 3 things written on a single sheet. A description of the lodger, taken down that same morning from Margaret Hughes, and from 2 other neighbours of Leveson Street. A young man of about 5 feet 8, with a fair complexion and reddish-brown hair worn long behind the ears, a straight nose, and grey eyes that were, in the words of one of the women, uncommonly steady, a dark coat of a decent cut but a little worn at the cuffs, a wide black hat, boots that had been recently cleaned, the false name he had given, which was John Wilson, and a list of the things that had gone from number 20. A gold watch on a chain with a small carnelian seal, a pair of gold earrings with garnets, a mourning brooch of black enamel with a plait of dark hair set behind glass, a leather purse, some silver. The purse and the silver, Whitty knew, were already spent, or would soon be. The watch and the jewellery were another matter. A man on the run in a great port with a stolen watch in his pocket has one useful place to go, and only one, and that is the door of a pawnbroker. And Liverpool in 1849 had a very great number of pawnbrokers indeed. Come with me down one of those lanes for a moment. I want you to see the shape of the thing. Behind the dockside streets, in the tangle of courts and alleys that ran back from the water, there stood in that year something over 200 pawnbroking shops. They had brass balls hung over their doors and a small painted board in the window and a counter of dark wood inside, and behind the counter a series of numbered pigeonholes, and in the pigeonholes the pledged goods of the poor of the town. Wedding rings, Sunday coats, christening spoons, sets of teeth. A man with a stolen watch could, on any morning in that year, walk into any one of those shops and put the watch down on the counter and get for it, in silver, a fraction of its worth and a numbered ticket, and no questions asked that he could not answer with a shrug. Whitty knew this. Every superintendent in the town knew it. And he knew, too, that the shop the fleeing man would look for was not one of the respectable houses on the main streets, but one of the poorer sort in the back lanes, where the pledges came in tied in dirty handkerchiefs, and the tickets were seldom redeemed. By the middle of the morning, therefore, he had constables moving through those lanes in pairs. They went into every shop. They asked to see the ledger for the previous afternoon and evening. They looked for a watch with a carnelian seal. They looked for garnet earrings. They looked for a mourning brooch. They looked for the pledged property of a fair young man with a Munster accent, who might have said his name was Wilson or Kelly or anything at all. For most of the 29th they found nothing. Ledgers were opened and closed. Pigeonholes were pulled out and put back. Brokers shook their heads. Some of them, Whitty later thought, were lying, in the ordinary way brokers lie to officers, about business they would rather not have on the books. Some of them were telling the truth. By the time the lamps were being lit again in the alleys off the water, the men were tired and the ledgers had begun to blur. And then, at some hour of the early evening, in a shop in a court off Great Howard Street, a broker turned a page in a ledger and stopped his finger on a line. He remembered the customer. He remembered him because the young man had been polite in a way that had struck him. He had come in at about 5 o'clock on the previous afternoon, wet through at the shoulders, with the collar of his coat turned up. He had laid on the counter a gold watch with a small red seal. He had asked for £2.10. He had taken £1.15. He had signed for it in a good hand. He had said his name was Watson. He had walked out of the shop and turned toward the river. The broker did not remember much of his face. Fair, he said. Reddish hair. A very steady way of speaking, without hurry. He was surprised to be told that the customer was Irish, and then he thought again and said, well, yes, perhaps he was, though the accent had been light and the man had kept his sentences short. The watch was still in the pigeonhole. It had a carnelian seal. It had, on the inside of the case, an inscription in fine letters. To Anne, from her father, 1842. Whitty had it in his hand before the hour was out. I want to stop with you here, on the pavement outside that shop, for one honest moment. It is one thing to read, in a modern account, that within a day of the murders the killer had already been traced to a specific pawn shop by his own carelessness. It is another to stand in the actual lane in the actual weather and see what that day looked like from inside a tunic. Whitty had, on the evening of the 29th, one confirmed transaction, in a false name that was not the false name they were already looking for, made in a shop in a court that had 8 streets running out of it in different directions. It was a beginning. It was not, yet, a trail. The trail widened the following morning. A second pawn shop, in a lane behind the custom house, had taken in a pair of gold earrings on the evening of the 28th, from a young man in a dark coat who had given the name James Doyle. A third, further north along the docks toward the north end, had taken in the mourning brooch from a young man of the same description who had given no name at all, only a signature that looked, when it was set beside the other two, to have been written by the same hand. 3 shops. 3 false names. 1 handwriting. Whitty sat with the 3 tickets on his desk on the morning of the 30th of March, and looked at the map of the town on his wall. The pawnings ran along a line from the middle of the docks out toward the north end. The line pointed away from Leveson Street. It pointed toward the streets around Vauxhall Road, where the poorest of the Irish arrivals were living 6 and 8 to a room in the common lodging houses. It was, if you thought of a man on foot with a bundle in his pocket, exactly the direction a stranger with no friends in the town and a great deal of silver to hide would have gone. He sent men into those streets that same morning. They went, again, in pairs. They went into every common lodging house on Vauxhall Road and its side streets. They asked the keepers who had come in on the evening of the 28th. They read the names in the greasy books at the doors. Kelly, Doyle, Ryan, Watson, Wilson. Half the names in those books were false, and every keeper knew it, and no keeper particularly cared, because a bed was a bed and a penny was a penny. They found, at a house in a court off Marybone, a keeper who remembered a young man who had come in a little before 6, on the evening of the 28th, wet at the shoulders, with a bundle under his coat. He had paid for a bed for 1 night. He had asked for a basin of water. He had gone out before dawn. He had left nothing behind. He had said his name was Kelly. That, and the wet coat and the bundle, was all. The trail, that morning of the 30th of March, ran out at that keeper's door. Come away with me from Marybone. Come back down to the water, because that is where Whitty went next, and that is where the case turned. The Mersey at Liverpool in 1849 was crossed at every hour of the day and half the hours of the night by ferries. They ran to Woodside and to Tranmere and to Rock Ferry and to New Ferry and to Eastham, one after the other, with their funnels smoking. A man on the run in Liverpool who had walked north through the lodging streets and then found no friend to hide him could not, for very long, remain in the town without being seen, because Whitty by now had his description in the hand of every constable on every beat. But a man who could scrape together the few coppers for a ticket could, in the space of a quarter of an hour, cross the water and stand on a different shore, in a different county, where the Liverpool borough force had no writ at all. Whitty, on the afternoon of the 30th, sent a messenger across on the Woodside ferry with a written note for the head constable of the county force in Cheshire. The note gave the description. It gave the false names. It gave the pawnbroker's tickets and the handwriting. It asked that every ferry landing on the Cheshire side and every village along the shore from Birkenhead down to Eastham be watched. He did not tell the messenger to hurry, because the messenger was already hurrying. While the note was crossing the water, Whitty went out himself, in plain clothes, along the Liverpool dock front. I want you to picture him for a moment, because I think it matters to see the man. He was in a dark overcoat and a low hat, and he walked with the ordinary rolling gait of a dockside customer, and he stopped at the doors of shipping offices, and at the counters of chandlers, and at the wickets of the ticket booths, and he asked one question, and one question only, in that light Cork accent that had never quite left him. Had any of them, on the 29th or the 30th, sold a passage to a young fair man in a dark coat with a Munster tongue, travelling under any name at all? The answers, mostly, were no. But at one booth, at the head of a landing stage on the north side, a clerk lifted his eyes from a ledger and thought for a moment, and said that on the morning of the 30th, in the first crossing after breakfast, he had sold a single fare to Tranmere to a young man who fitted the description almost exactly. The young man had paid in silver from a leather purse. He had given no name. He had carried a small parcel wrapped in a cotton handkerchief. He had asked the clerk what time the ferry would be back on the Liverpool side, and had then said, with a laugh, that he would not need to know that. The clerk had thought, at the time, that it was an odd thing to say. Whitty came away from the booth without hurrying. He sent word ahead by the next boat, so that the county constables on the Cheshire side would know, by the time he himself crossed, that the man they were looking for had been on the water no more than a day before them. Then he went back to Dale Street. He took 2 constables in plain clothes. He took a sergeant who knew Birkenhead well. And in the middle of the afternoon of the 31st of March, 3 days and a piece of a fourth after the front door of number 20 had closed behind the man in the dark coat, Michael Whitty stepped off the Woodside ferry onto the stones of the Cheshire shore. The rain had held off. The wind from the river was thin and cold. Ahead of him, along the road that ran south from Birkenhead through the villages of the peninsula, the small brick terraces of Tranmere climbed away toward the fields. Somewhere among those streets, in a room he had taken under yet another false name, a young man who called himself, on this new shore, by yet another name, was lying low and thinking, perhaps, that he had crossed a stretch of water wide enough to lose him. He had not. And the boots on the ferry stones behind him were already moving. A name at last. Come with me up the road from the ferry stones, because that is the road Whitty and his 3 men took, and it will tell you a great deal about the country the killer had chosen for his hiding. The road out of Woodside toward Tranmere on that last afternoon of March was a road of low brick houses and small front gardens, and here and there a field where a cow was standing at a hedge. It was quieter than any street on the Liverpool side. The wind from the river was at their backs. The gulls that had followed the ferry across the water were still crying above them for a little way, and then they turned and went home to the docks. Whitty and the 2 constables in plain clothes and the sergeant who knew Birkenhead walked in a loose row, 4 men going nowhere in particular, or so it would have looked to anyone standing at a window. They did not go straight into Tranmere. They went first to a small station house on the edge of Birkenhead, where the head constable of the county force was waiting for them, and where a Cheshire officer had spent the whole of the morning walking up and down the terraces above the ferry landing, with the description in his pocket. He had, by the time Whitty came in and sat down at the deal table, one piece of news. A young man of about the right age, in a dark coat and a wide black hat, had taken a bed the night before at a lodging house in a street called Bridge Street in the lower part of Tranmere. He had said he was a labourer looking for work at the yards. He had paid in silver from a leather purse. He had gone out that morning after his breakfast and had not, so far, come back. The keeper of the house, a widow who lived on the ground floor with her sister, had watched him from the window of her front room as he had walked away up the street, and she had noted, without knowing why she noted it, that he did not walk like a man on his way to look for work at the yards. He walked like a man taking care to look ordinary. She had mentioned it to the Cheshire constable when the constable came to her door in the middle of the morning, and the constable had thought it worth writing down. "Come outside with me for a moment. I want you to see how a manhunt in a small town in that year actually looked, because it did not look, from the pavement, like a manhunt at all. There were, in the whole of Tranmere that day, perhaps 6 men in uniform. They did not walk in pairs. They did not knock at doors. They sat, at intervals through the afternoon, at street corners and at the doors of public houses and on the low wall of the churchyard, and they watched. 2 men in plain clothes walked, very slowly, along Bridge Street and back again. A 3rd man, in the dress of a carter, stood for the best part of an hour beside a horse at the foot of the hill. Whitty himself, in his dark overcoat, sat in the back parlour of a public house on the corner of the main road, with a mug of ale he did not drink, and waited. The lodger came back to the widow's house on Bridge Street a little before 4 in the afternoon. He came up the hill on his own. He had a small parcel wrapped in a cotton handkerchief under his coat. The rain had held off all day, and the light on the sets of the street was the flat brown light of a March afternoon that is already thinking about evening. He was not hurrying. He passed the 2 men in plain clothes on the pavement without seeming to look at either of them. He touched his hat, in the ordinary way, to a woman standing at a front step. He turned in at the widow's door. He was inside the house perhaps 2 minutes. When he came out again he had left the parcel behind, and his coat was buttoned to the throat, and he had a fresh cloth stock at his neck that he had not been wearing when he went in. He came down the front step, and he set off up the road toward the fields at the top of the hill, at the same unhurried pace he had come by. He had gone 20 yards, no more, when the sergeant from Birkenhead stepped out of a doorway on his left, and the 2 constables in plain clothes closed on him from behind, and Whitty himself came up the pavement from the corner of the main road. There was no chase. There was no struggle worth calling a struggle. The record is very clear on that point, and I want to give it to you clean. The young man in the dark coat stopped in the middle of the pavement. He looked at the sergeant. He looked back at the 2 men behind him. He looked at Whitty coming up on his left. His hands came out very slowly from the pockets of his coat, and he opened them, palms outward, at about the level of his waist, in the way a man does who wants to be sure that no one thinks he is reaching for anything. He said one thing, and one thing only, in a Munster accent that was heavier now than it had been on the doorstep of number 20 Leveson Street. He said, "I am not going to make trouble for you, gentlemen." They took him back down the hill on foot. It was perhaps 300 yards. He walked in the middle, between the 2 constables, without being held. The sergeant walked in front. Whitty walked behind. They went along Bridge Street the way he had come, and past the widow's house without stopping, and down the road toward the ferry landing. People came to their front doors as they went by, and then went back inside, and then came out again to the pavement, and by the time the small party reached the station house at the edge of Birkenhead, there was a following of perhaps 24 townspeople at a respectful distance, silent, curious, not yet certain what they were seeing. "Come inside with me, only as far as the front room of the station house. I do not mean to keep you there long." They sat him at the deal table. They took his hat and his coat, and they laid the coat over the back of a chair, and they went through its pockets in front of him, one pocket at a time, and they set what came out of the pockets on the table between them. A leather purse, some silver, a folded paper, a short knife in a sheath, a ticket for a Liverpool pawnshop with a number written on it in ink, another ticket for another shop with another number, a small brass key on a length of twine. He watched them do it. He did not object. He did not, at any point in that first questioning, deny that the pawnshop tickets were his. He said only that he had bought the watch fare from a man on the Dock Road, and that he had pawned it because he had run short of the fare for the boat home to Ireland. He said the earrings had come the same way. He said the mourning brooch he had found in a gutter. He said all of this in the same steady, quiet voice he had used on the doorstep of the widow's house, and on the doorstep of number 20 Leveson Street the week before. Whitty asked him his name. He said his name was John Wilson. Whitty asked him whether he had ever been in a house on Leveson Street in Liverpool. He said he had not. Whitty asked him whether he knew a woman named Anne Hinrichsen and a servant named Mary Parr and 2 young boys of the same house. He said he had never heard the names in his life, sir. Come away with me, for a line only, from the deal table, because this is the point at which the record turns from the plain doing of police work to the slower and stranger business of finding out who a man really is. And I want you to know that a great deal of what I am about to tell you took not hours, but days, and in the end, weeks. The unmasking of the man on the pavement at Tranmere was not the unmasking of a moment. It was a slow rolling back of one false name after another, and the final layer was not fully lifted until he was already in the dock at the Liverpool Assizes some months later. The first thing that gave way was the name John Wilson. Whitty had, that same evening, sent the description of the prisoner and a note of his accent across the water to the head constable of the borough force, and the head constable had sent it down to the north end of the town, where the common lodging houses were, and by the morning of the 1st of April, a keeper on Vauxhall Road had come forward to say that a young man answering to that description had lodged with him for 3 nights in the middle of March, before moving on, and had given his name at that door as Maurice Gleeson. That was the second name. 2 days after that, a slop seller on the Dock Road, shown the prisoner through the small grated window of his cell, said that he had sold a coat and a black hat to that same young man in the last week of February, and that the young man on that day had given his name, in the shop, as John Kelly. That was the third. A ship's clerk, in the office of a small firm that ran packets to Ireland, remembered signing a young man of the same description onto the crew list of a vessel bound for Cork, some time in the previous autumn, under the name Michael Ryan. He had not sailed. He had come to the office the following morning and taken his name off again, and had walked out into the street without a word. That was the fourth. You can see, I hope, the shape of what Whitty and his men were working with. A young man who had come and gone through the port of Liverpool over the previous half-year under at least 4 names, none of which agreed with the others, and every one of which he had left behind him at the door of the next lodging-house, or the next shop, as easily as he took off his hat. Somewhere behind those 4 names was a 5th, which was the name he had been given at his baptism in Ireland, and which nobody in Liverpool yet knew. Come inside the cell with me for one more moment, but only to sit at the door. He was not put in a common cell. He was kept, at Whitty's order, in a small room by himself, with a constable on a stool outside the door at every hour of the day and night. He was allowed a Bible, at his own request. He was allowed pen and paper, which he did not use. He asked on the second day whether a priest of his own faith might come to him, and a priest was fetched from a church in Birkenhead, and the priest sat with him for the best part of an afternoon, and left again without saying to anyone in the station house what had passed between them, as was his office and his right. He was fed the ordinary food of a man on remand. He ate a little. He slept, the constables at the door said, in short spells, an hour or 2 at a time, and always on his back with his arm across his eyes. He did not cry out in the night. He did not, in the hearing of the men who sat outside his door, mention Leveson Street, or the Hinrichsen family, or Mary Parr, or the front room in which he had signed the false name in the false hand. He was taken across the water to Liverpool on the 3rd of April. They took him at a quiet hour. They put him on the small early ferry with 2 constables at his elbows and a 3rd behind him, and they landed at the George's pierhead in a thin rain, and they walked him up through the streets to the borough jail. Word had, by then, gone through the town that the man from Leveson Street was on his way. There were people on the pavements. There were more people at every corner. By the time the small party reached the gates of the Gale, there was a crowd, silent for the most part, standing 8 or 10 deep along the wall on the opposite side of the street. He did not look at them. He walked with his eyes on the stones. The gates of the Gale opened and closed behind him, and the crowd on the pavement, having seen what it had come to see, began, very slowly, to break up and drift back down toward the town. I want to end with you at the gates. It is easy, sitting somewhere warm and reading a printed account, to feel that the arrest of a man for the murder of a mother and 2 children and a servant is the moment at which the balance of a story comes right. But a man in a cell is not a mother restored to her children. A false name given up in a station house is not a young woman lifted from the boards of a corridor. The unmasking, when it finally came, gave the town back a name it could put in its newspapers, and it gave the police a prisoner they could bring, in due course, into a courtroom. It did not give back the afternoon of the 28th of March. Nothing was ever going to give back that afternoon. The gates of the gaol were of dark iron, and stood some 15 feet high. They were bolted on the inside by a warder who had been at his post for 30 years. He slid the bolt across without looking at the man he had just admitted. Somewhere within the building a clock struck the hour. The rain on the stones outside grew a little heavier. And down at the far end of Dale Street, a lamplighter had already begun his round for the evening, though the light was not yet gone from the sky, because he liked to be ahead of his work on a wet day. The man behind the gates would come out through them, in the days ahead, only twice. Once for the small hearing at which he would be committed for trial. Once for the trial itself, at the Liverpool Assizes, where the plain evidence of a pawnshop ledger and a broken young woman's deposition and 4 different false names would be laid, one after the other, in front of a jury of 12 men of the town. That court, and that ledger, and that deposition, and those names, are where our next hour begins. The court and the crowd. Come with me now into the last hot week of that summer, because the wet March in which the case had opened was long since past when the case came at last to be tried. The trial of the man they had first known as John Wilson began at the Liverpool Assizes on the 8th of August in 1849, some 4.5 months after the front door of number 20 Leveson Street had closed behind him. The building in which the courts of assize sat in that year was not the great columned hall that would one day rise on the plateau above Lime Street, because that hall was still being raised out of the ground and would not open its courts until the middle of the 1850s. Where exactly, in the older buildings of the town, the matter was heard, my sources do not entirely agree upon, and I would rather tell you honestly that this one detail is a little uncertain to me than pretend to a room I cannot properly furnish. What is not uncertain is what happened inside it. The courtroom, wherever it stood, was packed to the walls from before the doors were opened. People had come up from the streets of the North End where Mary Parr had lodged, and down from the terraces where the Hinrichsons had had friends, and in from Everton, and along the Scotland Road, and off the boats at the George's Pierhead, and by the middle of the morning there were more men and women standing on the pavement outside than there were seats inside. Tickets had been printed on the day before, on pale card, and given out at the office of the under-sheriff to persons of standing in the town, and by 7 in the morning those tickets were changing hands in Dale Street for a shilling apiece. The judge came onto the bench a little before 10. He was a man of the criminal calendar, in the scarlet robes of his office and the full wig that had been the mark of an assize judge for as long as any man in the room could remember. He carried in his gloved hand a pair of white kid gloves and a nosegay of dried lavender and rosemary, which the assize judges of England had carried on the northern circuits since the plague years 2 centuries before, when the flowers had been thought to keep the sickness of a gale away from the person of the bench. He set the nosegay down beside his water-glass. The court rose. The court sat again. The clerk of assize read out the charge. The charge, in the plain language of the era's own indictment, was that the prisoner at the bar had, on the 28th day of March in the year 1849, at the parish of Liverpool in the county of Lancaster, feloniously, wilfully, and of malice aforethought, killed and murdered one Anne Hinrichson, one Henry Hinrichson aged 5 years, one John Hinrichson aged 3 years and 11 months, and one Mary Parr, spinster, of the same parish. 4 counts. 4 names. The clerk read each name evenly. When he had finished, he asked the prisoner how he would be tried. The prisoner said, "By God and my country." I want to stop here with you for one line only, because that phrase has a long history behind it. It is what a man in a court of assize was expected to answer to the clerk when the counts had been read out, and it was the older way of saying that he would submit himself to the judgment of God above and the 12 jurymen below. He said it steadily. He said it, one of the reporters at the press table later wrote, without hurry and without any shaking in his voice, in the same Munster tongue that had greeted Mary Parr on the step of number 20 in March. And then he stood, with his hands resting lightly on the wooden rail of the dock, and let the court begin. I ought to tell you what he looked like on that morning, because a very great many people in the room were seeing him for the first time. He was, by every account of that day, a young man of an ordinary appearance. He was perhaps 5 feet and 8 inches in height. His hair, which had been described in March as reddish-brown and worn long behind the ears, had been cut down in the borough gale to a decent length for the dock. His shirt was clean. His chin was shaved. His eyes, which one reporter described as being of a colour hard to fix on the page, looked out at the court with the same steady, uninquisitive attention with which he had looked at the sergeant on the pavement in Tranmere in March. He did not, at any hour of the day that followed, appear to be a man in fear. Come with me across the well of the court, past the barristers at their long table with their briefs tied in pink tape, past the clerks at their books, to the witness box on the far side of the room, because it is at the witness box that a trial in that year was really made or broken, and the witnesses in this trial came up one after the other for the best part of 2 days. The first of them was Margaret Hughes. You may remember her. She was the neighbour from 3 doors down on Leveson Street, who had gone out into the road at 7 in the evening on the 28th of March at the sound of a woman crying at a doorway, and who had gone into the house at number 20 in her carpet slippers with her shawl over her head, and who had found, in the corridor of the ground floor, a young woman lying against the wall. She was in the box for the best part of an hour. She spoke about the card in the front window and the calling of the lodger in the days before. She described, without being asked to spare the court, what she had seen in the corridor and on the stairs and in the front bedroom above. She described at the end how she had held Mary Parr's hand for the greater part of that night and the following day in her own back parlour, and how she had put her ear to Mary Parr's mouth in the last hour to catch the words that came out of it, and how she had written those words down on a sheet of paper with her son's school pencil, because she had been told by the constable at the door that any word the young woman gave might one day be needed. That sheet of paper was in court. It had been folded and refolded a great many times over the 4 months since. The clerk of assize took it from her and read it aloud. It was a plain deposition of the sort a magistrate might have taken at a bedside if there had been time to fetch one, though there had not. It described a young man of about the prisoner's age and height, in a dark coat, with reddish-brown hair and a light Munster accent, who had come into the house on the afternoon of the 28th of March, and who had, some hours later, done what had been done in the front room and on the stairs. It named no other person. It gave no other cause. It ended with a line that Margaret Hughes, in the witness box, said had been almost the last thing that came out of Mary Parr's mouth before her breathing changed. The line was, "He was quiet, Mrs." He was quiet the whole time. The counsel for the prisoner rose to cross-examine. He was a man in his late 30s, in the plain black gown of the junior bar, and he had been given the brief only 10 days before the trial, out of the modest funds the court set aside in that year for the defence of men who could not pay for one of their own. He was not, by any account, an unskilled advocate. He put his questions to the witness courteously. He asked whether the young woman in the back parlour had, at any hour of that night or the following day, ever named the prisoner by name. Margaret Hughes said she had not. He asked whether she had ever pointed at the prisoner, or at a picture of him, or at any drawing of any man, and said, "That is the man." Margaret Hughes said she had not, and could not have, because the young woman had never seen the prisoner alive again after the door of number 20 had closed behind him. He asked whether the description on the paper might, in the barest words of it, fit a great many young men in the town of Liverpool. Margaret Hughes said, after a pause, that she supposed it might. He sat down. It was, in the circumstances of the case, the best that a counsel could do. Let me be honest with you about what the defence was actually trying to hold together. The prisoner had, in his coat pockets on the pavement in Tranmere, the pawn tickets for the gold watch inscribed to Anne, and for the earrings and for the mourning brooch, all of them the household property of number 20 Leveson Street. He had signed for each of those pledges in a hand which, when the 3 tickets were laid side by side on the desk in the borough offices, was plainly the same hand. He had done so under 3 different false names. He had, in the days before the trial, been identified in his cell in Kirkdale gaol by the widow of Bridge Street in Tranmere, who had let him a bed, by the ferry clerk, who had sold him the passage across the water, by the slop seller on the dock road, who had sold him the coat and the hat, and by the keeper of a common lodging-house off Vauxhall Road, who had let him a bed in the middle of March, under yet another name again. Against all of that, and against the paper of Mary Parr's deposition read out in court, no counsel in England could have brought the prisoner off. His counsel, whatever his own private view of the case, was not asking the jury to acquit. He was asking them, in the older phrase, to take mercy in their pocket when they went to their room. The pawnbrokers came up next. The first was the broker from a court off Great Howard Street, who identified from the dock the young man who had brought him the watch with the carnelian seal on the afternoon of the 28th of March. The second was the broker from a lane behind the custom house, who identified the same young man as the person who had brought him the garnet earrings on the evening of the same day. The third was a broker from the North End, who identified the same young man as the person who had brought in the mourning brooch of black enamel with the plait of dark hair behind the glass. Each broker was shown the ticket from his own ledger. Each broker read the signature on his own ticket. The 3 tickets were laid together on the clerk's table, and the jury was invited, in due course, to compare the handwriting for themselves. Michael Whitty was called on the afternoon of the second day. He was, I ought to remind you, the corkman who had led the case from the morning after the murders, and who had stood on the pavement in Tranmere when the prisoner came out of the widow's lodging-house with his fresh stock at his throat. He wore his dark tunic. He gave his evidence in the ordinary sober way of a superintendent of a borough force in that year, without flourish and without any raising of his voice. He described the search of the pawnshops. He described the crossing on the Woodside ferry. He described the walk up the hill in Tranmere. He described the arrest. When he was asked, at the end of his evidence, whether the prisoner at the bar was the man he had taken on the pavement in Bridge Street on the 31st of March, he looked once across the well of the court to the dock, and he said, "He is, my lord." The prisoner watched him. He did not, at any point of Whitty's evidence, shake his head or make any sound at all. The counsel for the Crown closed his case a little before 4 in the afternoon of that second day. The counsel for the prisoner then rose and addressed the jury for the best part of an hour, and said, in effect, the only thing that a man in his position could say. He said that the case rested on the pawnshops and the false names, and that the pawnshops and the false names were evidence of theft, and perhaps of a receiving of stolen goods, but not, in themselves, evidence of the doing of the deed itself. He asked the jury to remember that no living person in the town of Liverpool had seen the prisoner strike a single blow. He asked them to remember that Mary Parr, whose deposition was the nearest thing in the case to the voice of a witness, had never named the prisoner by name. He asked them, in the closing line of his speech, to send the prisoner to a hard punishment for the theft if they must, but to hold back their hands from the last punishment for the killing, because in the last punishment there was no undoing. The judge summed up. He spoke for perhaps 40 minutes. He went, count by count, through the evidence. He reminded the jury that a chain of circumstance, if it were long enough and tight enough, might weigh with them as much as the finger of an eyewitness, but that they must be satisfied of every link of it before they returned a verdict. He read out again the deposition of Mary Parr. He read out again the descriptions given by the neighbours on Leveson Street. He read out again the note made by the ferry clerk of the passage sold on the morning of the 30th of March. He set down his papers. He asked the jury whether they wished to withdraw. They said they did. They were gone from the box for a quarter of an hour, no more. When they came back to it, the foreman, a merchant of the town whose name is in the record but whom I will not trouble you with here, was asked whether they had reached a verdict upon which they were all agreed. He said they had. He was asked, on each of the 4 counts in turn, whether the prisoner at the bar was guilty or not guilty of the murder of that person. 4 times he answered, "Guilty, my lord." The judge asked the prisoner whether he had anything to say for himself before sentence was passed. The prisoner said only, "I am not the man, my lord." The judge put on the black cap. It was a square of dark cloth no larger than a folded handkerchief, and he set it on the top of his wig without hurry, and he leaned forward a little, and he sentenced the prisoner to be taken from that place to the place from whence he had come, and from thence to a place of lawful execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until his body was dead, and that his body was then to be buried within the precincts of the gaol in which he was last confined, and might the Lord have mercy on his soul. The court, from the moment the verdict had been given to the moment the last word of the sentence was spoken, made no sound at all. When the judge had finished, the warders in the dock touched the prisoner on the elbow, and he turned, without looking behind him, and he went down the wooden steps into the cells. Outside, on the pavement, the crowd that had waited in the street through the whole of that August afternoon heard the news at second hand from the men and women coming out of the doors. It did not cheer. It did not, according to one of the reporters who was there, do very much of anything at all. It stood for a while in the summer light, and then it began, in twos and threes, to drift back down toward the town. The date on the writ that came down from the bench that afternoon was set for the middle of the following month. There were a little over 4 weeks between the sentence and the day named upon it. In those 4 weeks, the man in the cell at Kirkdale would receive visits from a chaplain and, at his own asking, from a priest of his own faith. He would give up, at last, the name he had been born with. He would dictate a statement that would be read across the town in the days after, and on a morning of that following month, on a scaffold set against the outer wall of the gaol at Kirkdale, in front of a crowd that no writer of that day was afterwards able to number with any confidence, the sentence passed on him under the black cap in Liverpool would be carried out. The rope was already being made ready. The rope at Kirkdale. Come with me one last time, and I will keep my voice low, because we are near the end of the hour and near the end of the story, and neither of us has come here for spectacle. The morning we have to look at was the 15th of September in 1849, a Saturday. 4 weeks and 2 days had passed since the black cap had been set on the top of a wig in the courtroom in Liverpool. In those weeks a great many things had happened inside the walls of Kirkdale jail, and almost none of them are the kind of thing that a listener wants read aloud in the small hours. I will give you the ones that matter. The man in the condemned cell had, on the 2nd week after the sentence, given up at last the name he had been born with. He had said it to the chaplain of the gaol and to the priest of his own faith who came out to him from a small church in the town, and he had said it as if he were laying down a weight he had been tired of carrying for a long while. The name was Maurice Gleeson. He was, he said, a native of the parish of Limerick, of poor Irish parents, and he had come across the water in the spring of the year before, under one of the false names he had used since. That was the first thing. The second was that he had, in a plain hand and in the presence of the 2 clergymen, dictated a written statement. The statement did not attempt to deny the deed. It did not, either, attempt to explain it in any way that a hearer could take home and turn over. It was a short thing. It admitted, in the flat words the shorthand writer put down for him, that he had gone to the house on Leveson Street on the 28th of March with the intention of taking whatever silver or watch or purse he could find in it, and that when the mother of the house had come out onto the landing with one of the children in her arms, he had done what he had done, because he could think of nothing else to do. It names no confederate. It laid no share of the blame on the drink, though he had drunk that morning, or on any older wrong done to him, though the priest had asked him gently whether there had been one. It ended with a line that many in the town would afterwards remember, because the newspapers would print it in a black border on the day after the hanging. He had said, "I do not ask that anyone should forgive me. I ask only that they should pray for the 4 souls I have put out of this world." The third thing was that he had eaten, over those 4 weeks, a little less each day and slept a little less each night, and that by the middle of the last week, the chaplain and the warders were finding him at every hour with the Bible open on his knee at the same page, which was the 51st Psalm. He read it out to himself under his breath in the Munster tongue of his childhood. He read it, one of the warders said afterwards, without any performance and without any lift in the voice, as a man might read a letter from home that he had already read 100 times. Come outside with me now to the road in front of the Gale, because that is where the rest of the story is. Kirkdale Gale in that year stood on a low rise on the northern edge of the town, on a strip of ground that had once been fields, and that in the years since had come to be edged on 3 sides by small brick terraces, and on the 4th by the long grey wall of the Gale itself. In front of that wall was a stretch of open ground, and beyond the open ground was the road, and beyond the road, sloping away toward the river, were more brick terraces, and further off, the yards and the funnels of the docks. The scaffold, when it went up for a hanging at Kirkdale, went up against the outer wall of the Gale, above what was called the debtor's door, so that the drop stood some 15 feet above the ground, and could be seen from every part of the open field, and from the road beyond it. The scaffold for our mourning went up in the small hours of the Saturday, under torches. It was built by 2 carpenters in the pay of the borough, both of whom had built it before, and both of whom worked without speaking, because there was, by the small hours, already a crowd standing in the open ground below them, and any word passed between them on the platform would have been heard by every person in the first 4 rows. The crowd had begun to gather the day before. I will not give you a number for it, because I cannot give you an honest one. The papers of the following week put the figure at anything between 30,000 and 100,000, and neither the papers nor the borough officers had any means of counting it. What is true is that the terraces on the far side of the road were black with people at every window, and on every roof from before first light, and that the open ground below the wall was full from wall to road, and that the road itself, at the hour of the hanging, was said by one of the constables on duty to be so pressed with bodies that a horse could not have been walked through it. Men had come out from the town and in from the villages along the shore. Women had come, though the papers, in a fit of decency they did not always practice, disapproved of that. Children had been brought. A ballad seller had set up his board at the corner of the road at 4 in the morning, and by the hour of the hanging had sold, he later said, every sheet on it. Come with me across the open ground, past the ballad seller, and past the women selling small mugs of tea out of a covered barrow, and stand with me at the foot of the outer wall for one moment, because I want you to feel the strange quality of the quiet that came down over that field at 8 o'clock. The scaffold was in place. A single bell had begun to toll from the chapel inside the Gale, 1 stroke and then a slow gap, and then 1 stroke again, in the manner appointed for a Christian execution in that year. The crowd, which had been in a low, steady hum since first light, dropped its voice by degrees, as a room does when a speaker rises. By the time the bell had struck a dozen times, the field of some tens of thousands of people was almost silent, and you could hear, above the hush, the calling of a single gull that had come up from the river. The door in the wall opened, and the small procession came out onto the platform. There were, at the head of it, the 2 clergymen, the chaplain of the Gale in his black gown, and the priest from the town in his cassock, and they walked side by side, and they were reading, each in his own book. Behind them came the governor of the Gale, in his dark coat with a paper in his hand. Behind him came 2 warders in the plain dress of their office, and between them came the prisoner. Behind the prisoner, at a pace of his own, came the executioner. I will name the executioner, because he is a fact of the day, and because he was to become, in a small way, a byword in the years that followed. He was William Calcraft of London. He had come up on the train from the south the day before. He was, in that year, in the middle of a working life that would keep him at his office for another quarter of a century, and he had, by the hour of that Saturday morning, put to death more men and women in the towns of England than any hangman before him or after him. He wore a long dark coat and a low black hat. He carried, folded over his left arm, the pinioning straps and the white cotton hood. The prisoner walked out onto the platform on his own feet, without being held. He was dressed as he had been in court, in a plain dark suit and a clean shirt without a collar, so that the rope should have nothing to catch on at the throat. His hands were tied lightly in front of him at the wrists with a length of cord. His face, one of the reporters at the rail of the scaffold later wrote, was of the colour of paper, but he did not falter in his step, and he did not, at any moment of the walk from the door to the drop, look out over the field at the crowd. He stopped where he was placed. The chaplain stood at his right hand. The priest stood at his left. The chaplain read, in a voice pitched to carry only as far as the rail, the opening lines of the burial service, which it was the custom of the English jails in that year to begin at the foot of the drop. "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." The priest, on the other side, read the office of his own church in Latin, in a low tone, without lifting his eyes from the book. The prisoner listened to both, and moved his lips a little to the words of the priest, and once, when the priest paused, said in a plain voice, "Amen." The governor stepped forward with his paper. He read out the sentence of the court in a short, flat form, without preamble, and folded the paper again, and put it away in the pocket of his coat, and stepped back. Calcraft came forward. "I will not draw this out for you. I will only tell you what happened, in the plain order in which it happened, and then I will step back with you into the crowd." Calcraft took the prisoner by the elbow, very gently, and moved him the last 2 paces to the mark on the boards. He undid the light cord at the wrists, and rebound the arms behind the back with the leather straps, and then he passed a second strap around the knees. He took the white hood from his arm, and asked the prisoner, in the low working voice he used at that hour, whether he was ready. The prisoner said he was. Calcraft drew the hood down over his head. He set the noose about his neck, and adjusted the knot to the left of the jaw, in the ordinary way of his office. He stepped back 1 pace, to the lever. The prisoner, under the hood, was heard by the 2 clergymen on the platform to say, in a clear voice, "Lord Jesus, receive my soul." Calcraft drew the lever. There is not, in the papers of the following morning, any account of that moment that goes on for more than a single sentence. The most honest of them says only that the drop fell, and that the body of the condemned man was seen to swing a little against the outer wall of the gale, and that the crowd in the open ground beneath, which had been silent all through the reading of the services, made no sound at all for the length of perhaps a minute together, and then, in 1s and 2s and then in 10s, and then all at once, began to turn away. "Come away from the wall with me now." There is nothing more, on that platform, that a listener needs. We will walk, if you will let me, back across the open ground toward the road, in the general drift of the crowd. It is a strange kind of walking. There is no talking to speak of. A woman ahead of us is holding the hand of a small child, and lifting the child every few paces to keep it out of the mud, and the child is asking, over and over, in the way a very young child does, a question that its mother is not answering. A man in a working jacket has taken off his cap and is turning it round and round in his hands as he walks. The ballad seller at the corner has already packed up his board and gone, because ballads sell before a hanging, and not after one. The women with the tea barrow are quietly closing their lids. By the striking of 9, the field in front of the wall of Kirkdale jail was almost empty. By 10, the scaffold had been taken down again by the same 2 carpenters who had put it up. By the middle of the day, the town was going about its ordinary Saturday, and the shops on Scotland Road were open, and the ferries were running across the water to Woodside, and boys were selling oranges from a basket at the corner of Dale Street. The body of the man who had gone through the debtor's door at 8 in the morning had, by the custom of the era's own sentence, been taken back within the walls, and buried, that afternoon, in an unmarked grave in the yard of the Gale, in quicklime, without a stone, as the writ had directed. There is one thing more, and then I will let you rest. Number 20 Leveson Street was cleaned by the parish, and the rooms in which the killing had been done were repapered and repainted, and the front door was rehung, and a new card was put in the parlour window, and for a long while no one would take a room in that house at any price. In the end, the whole terrace was renamed by the town, quietly and without ceremony, so that the address at which the Hinrichsen family had lived should not appear on the printed guides of Liverpool for the visitors and the strangers to read. The little brass fittings of the front door were replaced. The wooden animals that the 2 boys had played with on the last afternoon of their lives were, at the request of the father when he came home at last, given away to the children of neighbours he had never met. Mary Parr was buried in a small churchyard in the parish where she had been born. Anne and Henry and John Hinrichsen were laid together in a single grave, at the wish of the father, on a slope of ground in the town cemetery where the wind from the river comes up on the wet days. The father lived on, quietly, in another town. He did not marry again. He did not, so far as the record goes, speak about that afternoon in Liverpool to any person for the rest of his life. What he thought in the long evenings of the years that followed, in a room somewhere with a lamp burning on a table, is not a thing the record will ever give us, and it is not a thing we have any right to guess at. It belongs to him. The gale at Kirkdale itself stood for another 40 years, and was then pulled down, and the ground it had stood on was built over, and if you were to walk that part of the town today, which is not a walk I would send you on, you would find a road there, and some newer buildings, and nothing at all above ground to tell you where the wall had been on which the scaffold went up on that September morning. The kettle on the hob of number 20 is long cold. The card in the parlour window is long taken down. The knocker on the front door of that house has been struck a great many times since by a great many hands, and by hands that did not know, and had no reason to know, that a small boy had once heard a knocker fall against a brass plate at 3 o'clock on a wet afternoon in 1849, and had looked up and had smiled because he thought it was his father come home early. That is the whole of it. There is no lesson at the end of it that I want to press on you tonight. There is only the record, which we have gone through together as gently as we could, and the 4 names in it that a listener should try, if they are still awake enough, to hold for a moment before they let the hour go. Anne Hinrichsen, Henry Hinrichsen, John Hinrichsen, Mary Parr. The candle has burned low. The house is quiet around you. The rain, if there is rain where you are, is only rain. Sleep if you can. History, once again, turns the page in the dark.